Before dawn, the city always smelled different. In the hours before the bells, before the market carts creaked awake, before priests cleared their throats to call the faithful, the air belonged to people like me. It held yesterday's smoke and spilled ale, damp straw, old sweat, and the faint sweetness of bread rising somewhere far away. I learned long ago to wake before the light, because daylight made everything too honest. In the dark, no one asked who I was. They already knew. My name, at least the one I used outside, was Marjorie. It was plain enough to forget, and common enough to belong to anyone. I had another name once, a real one, spoken by my mother in a house that no longer existed, but names like that were for remembering quietly. In the room I rented above the tanner's shed, the ceiling pressed low and the walls wept damp, I sat up on my straw mattress and wrapped my cloak around myself. Winter lingered even in spring, and the cold crawled into bones the way regret crawls into thoughts slowly, then all at once. I washed my face with water that smelled faintly of iron and rubbed my hands together until they stung. My body was already awake, aching in familiar places, counting what the day would ask of it. There was no mirror. I didn't need one. I knew the shape of my face by how men looked at it, by how they hesitated before speaking, by how much they were willing to pay. Down below, the city stirred. A rooster cried as if surprised to still be alive. Somewhere, a cartwheel protested its fate. I pulled on my boots, checked the small purse tied to my belt light, always light, and went down the stairs that leaned like an old drunk against the wall. By the time the sun crept over the roofs, I was already at work, though not the sort most people imagine. Mornings were for errands, favors, small exchanges that kept me fed. I carried messages for a brewer's wife who didn't want her letters read. I fetched water for a woman whose legs had failed her. I swept the front of the alehouse where I spent my evenings, because the owner liked a clean threshold and a woman who didn't ask questions. People think a woman like me exists only at night, but the day claimed me first. I learned which streets were safe before the bells, which corners belonged to guild men who liked to pretend they didn't know me, which priests would look away and which would stop to lecture. Some days the lecture cost me more than a night's work, because words have weight in a city that pretends to be holy. By mid-morning the market was alive. Chickens screamed, fish lay like silver accusations on wooden boards, and everything smelled of mud and money. I stood near the edge, not selling anything but myself in the quiet way women like me did, during daylight, eyes lowered just enough to be respectable, posture loose enough to promise ease. Day clients were different. They were men who couldn't risk being seen at night, men with wives who counted footsteps, men whose shame needed sunlight to hide in. I chose carefully. Hunger makes poor decisions tempting, but bruises cost more than bread. When a merchant with soft hands and a nervous smile offered me coin, I weighed the sound of his voice, the way his gaze flicked toward the church, the smell of fear and privilege. I followed him to a narrow room above a cloth shop where the walls were thin and the expectations thinner. I kept my eyes on the cracks in the plaster and let my thoughts wander to safer places, the river in summer, the sound of geese, the feeling of being unnecessary. When it was over, he pressed extra coin into my hand without meeting my eyes. Gratitude in his language. I left before the room could remember me. By noon, the bells rang and I ate. Bread, coarse and hard at the edges, dipped in thin stew I bought from a woman who didn't ask what I did for a living because she already knew and needed the money anyway. We sat on the curb, sharing silence, watching respectable people hurry past as if the street might stain them. Afternoons were the longest part of the day. The city slowed, and so did opportunity. I rested when I could, leaning against sun-warmed stone, listening to gossip carried like pollen. Executions announced days in advance. Taxes crept higher. A new bishop was coming, which meant rules would tighten for a while, then loosen again when everyone grew tired of pretending. Sometimes I went to the bathhouse. Not to work, those places were dangerous for women like me, but to soak my feet in borrowed warmth. The steam hid faces and made us equal for a moment. Scarred women, tired wives, old men whose bodies remembered youth with bitterness. In the fog, no one belonged anywhere. As evening approached, I returned to my room. This was when I became deliberate. I cleaned myself carefully, combed my hair, chose which dress to wear. There were 3, one for common nights, one for better-paying clients, and one I saved for days when I needed to remember I was still a woman, not a service. The cloth was worn thin, but it held the shape of me like a promise that hadn't quite broken. Before going out, I touched the small wooden charm I kept hidden in my bodice. It had been my mother's. I didn't know what it was meant to protect, but it had protected me from forgetting. Night changed the city's rules. Respectable women vanished indoors. Men grew braver, louder, crueler, kinder sometimes all at once. I took my place near the alehouse door, where warmth spilled out with laughter and the smell of meat. The owner nodded at me, a signal that meant I was tolerated as long as I caused no trouble and paid my share. Clients came in waves. A soldier fresh from the road, lonely and aching for something familiar. A clerk drunk on his own daring. A widower who talked more than he touched. Each encounter was a negotiation, silent or spoken, with boundaries drawn in chalk that could wash away if I wasn't careful. I learned to listen, to sigh at the right moment, to laugh softly, to disappear while still being present. My body was a language I spoke fluently, but my survival depended on reading theirs. Between clients, I drank watered ale and watched the room. Fights bloomed and died. Songs rose and fell. Sometimes I caught my reflection in a metal cup, older than I felt, younger than I feared. The night wore on, and with it my patience thinned like the solace of my shoes. Not every night was dangerous, but every night carried danger in its pocket. A hand that squeezed too hard. A promise not kept. A man who thought payment erased restraint. I relied on other women, on glances exchanged, on the unspoken rule that we protected our own when we could. Solidarity was fragile, but it was real. Near midnight, business slowed. Coins clinked heavier in my purse now, enough to last a few days if luck held. I slipped away before exhaustion made me careless, walking home through streets that belonged to shadows again. The city felt hollow at that hour, like a body after breath leaves it. In my room, I counted my earnings carefully. I set aside rent first, then food, then a small hopeful pile for a future that might never arrive. I washed again, as much for my spirit as my skin, and lay down on the mattress that knew all my secrets. Sleep came unevenly. Dreams mixed memory and fear, faces without names, hands without bodies. When I woke before dawn, the city was quiet again, and for a brief moment I belonged to myself. This was my life, not a scandal, not a morality tale, not a secret whispered by men who would never say my name aloud. It was work. It was endurance. It was the art of staying alive in a world that preferred not to see me unless it needed something. And when the sun rose once more over the crooked roofs, I sat up, wrapped my cloak around my shoulders, and began again. The second dawn of that telling came quietly, like an apology that didn't quite mean it. My body protested when I stood, joints cracking like old wood, but pain was a language I spoke daily. I dressed slowly, letting each movement decide whether the day would be kind or sharp. Outside, frost clung to the stones, and I breathed into my hands before stepping into the street that knew my footsteps better than any home ever had. There were days when I thought of leaving. Every woman I knew did. The idea lived like a coin tucked behind the earfelt, often, spent never. Leaving required money, yes, but more than that it required a place willing to forget you. Cities do not forget women like me. They remember us in whispers and warnings and the way doors close softly when we approach. Still, the thought warmed me as I walked, imagining a village where no one knew my face, where bread was cheaper and names mattered again. Morning work found me near the river, where washerwomen knelt and beat cloth against stones as if punishing it for daring to be dirty. They spoke openly there, voices loud enough to scare away eavesdroppers. I listened without appearing to. Listening was a skill that paid better than speaking. News traveled faster than carts. A lord's son had arrived with coin and boredom. A patrol had been doubled near the east gate. A woman had been taken ill in the south quarter and needed someone to sit with her for a few hours. I offered myself for the sitting. Care work was honest, and it earned me a crust of bread and a bowl of milk that tasted like mercy. The sick woman slept most of the time, breath shallow, skin hot. I wiped her brow and wondered who would do the same for me if I fell. Women like me did not often get sick slowly. We vanished quickly, swallowed by fever or violence, leaving behind rooms no one claimed. When her daughter returned, eyes rimmed red, she pressed my hand and thanked me without asking my name. Gratitude was easier without details. By afternoon, clouds thickened, and the city smelled of rain before the rain arrived. I sheltered under an overhang near the Guildhall, watching men argue over rules that never seemed to apply to me unless they needed to. A clerk I recognized passed by, his eyes sliding away, then back. He stopped, shifted his weight, asked if I might meet him later. His voice carried fear and entitlement in equal measure. I named my price. He agreed too quickly. I made a note of that and raised it slightly. He hesitated, then nodded. Negotiation was a small victory, but it kept my ribs unbroken. Rain fell hard and sudden, turning dust into paste. I walked carefully, skirts hitched, boots slipping. At my room, I waited until the worst passed, mending a tear with thread borrowed and returned too many times to count. Needlework gave my hands something gentle to do, a reminder they were capable of more than endurance. Evening came early under heavy clouds. The alehouse glowed like a promise it could not keep. Inside, the air was thick with heat and impatience. I took my place, exchanged nods, accepted a cup I didn't want because refusing would invite questions. The clerk arrived late, already flushed, his courage borrowed from drink. We went to a room I knew well, its floorboards memorized. He spoke of his wife without being asked, of duty, of guilt. I let him talk. Words cost nothing and bought compliance. When it ended, he lingered, as if staying longer might make it meaningful. I stood. He paid. Meaning was not part of the bargain. Later, a young man approached me with a confidence that had not yet learned fear. I sent him away gently. Some lessons should come from somewhere else. He would thank me someday without knowing why. Not all nights offered choice. A group of men laughed too loudly, watched too closely. I kept distance, stayed near the door, caught the eye of the owner. Protection was a dance of glances and favors remembered. When one of the men grabbed my wrist, I twisted free and spoke sharply. The room quieted just enough. He cursed, but his friends laughed, and laughter can be a leash if pulled right. I moved away, heart pounding, anger tasting metallic. Near closing, an older man sat alone, hands folded, eyes tired. He asked nothing improper, paid fairly, spoke of a woman long gone as if she might return through me. I listened. Sometimes companionship was the only thing on offer, and sometimes it was enough. When he left, he bowed his head slightly. Respect came in strange disguises. Walking home, the rain returned, softer now, turning lamps into halos. I thought of the sick woman by the river, of the clerk's wife, of the washerwomen whose hands were red and strong. I thought of myself as part of a hidden city layered beneath the visible one, a place built of women's labor and men's silence. At home I counted my coins again. The future pile grew by one. I touched the wooden charm, lay down and listened to the rain stitch the night back together. Sleep came deeper this time, heavy and dreamless. When dawn found me again, I did not curse it. I rose, wrapped my cloak tight, and stepped into the street that would take from me what it must and give back what it could. I did not know how many days like this I had left, only that I would meet them standing, eyes open, alive. And so the day began again, not with hope exactly, but with resolve, the quiet, stubborn kind that survives even when the world insists it should not. The third morning came with bells, sharp and insistent, slicing through sleep like a blade through cloth. I lay still until the echoes faded, counting breaths, listening for footsteps outside my door. Nothing. Just the city stretching, joints popping, lungs filling with the same old air. I rose because not rising was not an option anyone had ever given me. That day was a feast day, which meant trouble wrapped in celebration. Streets would swell, pockets would loosen, and rules would blur. It also meant priests everywhere, eyes sharper than usual, voices louder. I chose my plainest dress and pinned my hair tight. Visibility was a kind of danger. The morning was spent dodging crowds and opportunity alike. I helped an old man carry a basket in exchange for a few apples, bruised but sweet. I shared one with a child who stared too openly, curiosity untrained by fear. His mother pulled him away, whispering warnings that would someday make sense to him. I watched them go, wondering which lessons would stick and which would be unlearned by hunger. Near midday, a woman I knew as Anne caught my arm. She worked the same streets I did, though we rarely crossed paths by choice. Competition made friendship thin, but crisis made it strong. She told me one of the watch had been asking questions, names, places. Someone had complained, as if we were a spill that could be wiped away with enough effort. We exchanged information quickly, routes adjusted, signals agreed upon. Survival was a shared language, even when trust was scarce. The feast brought music and noise. Drums pounded like an extra heartbeat. I stayed near the edges where exits were plentiful. Men flushed with wine mistook confidence for invincibility. I sold laughter cheaply and myself carefully. One client paid in foreign coin, heavy and strange. I bit it lightly, a habit learned early, and tucked it away. Money from elsewhere carried dreams with it, even if they were borrowed. As dusk fell, the city tilted toward excess. Fires burned brighter, shadows danced wildly. A fight broke out near the square, blood bright against stone. I turned away before curiosity could cost me. Violence was contagious. Later, in a quiet moment behind the alehouse, Anne and I shared bread and silence. She spoke of leaving, of a cousin in another town, of work that didn't require pretending. I listened, neither encouraging nor discouraging. Hope was fragile, and breaking it felt like a sin. When she left, I watched her disappear into the crowd and wondered if I would ever see her again. Night deepened. Business came and went. My body moved from habit, my mind elsewhere. I thought of the foreign coin, of the apples, of the wooden charm warm against my skin. I thought of all the versions of myself that might have existed if the world had turned slightly differently. Near the end, as the fires burned low, a patrol passed too close. I held my breath, blended into shadow, became unremarkable. They moved on. I exhaled slowly, grateful for invisibility. Home felt farther than usual. When I finally reached it, I sat on the edge of the mattress and laughed once, softly, at nothing in particular. Laughter was rare alone, but it reminded me I was still here. I lay down, the city humming beneath me, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would ask again. And I would answer not because it was noble or right, but because I could, because I was alive. The next day began without ceremony, as most important things did. No bells, no shouts, just the slow gray light seeping through the cracks in the shutters, touching my eyelids until sleep released me. My body felt heavier than usual, as if it had been carrying not only itself but all the days before it. I sat up and waited for the weight to settle into something manageable. Outside, the feast had left its marks. Broken cups, trampled ribbons, a shoe with no owner. The city after celebration always looked embarrassed, as if it wished to pretend nothing had happened. I stepped carefully, avoiding puddles that smelled of wine and worse, and made my way toward the river. Water understood things people did not. It carried away what it could and kept the rest moving. I washed my hands and face, watching my reflection ripple and blur. Some days I searched that water for signs, age, sickness, the future, but it never told me anything new. It simply reflected what stood before it, and then forgot. There was comfort in that. Mid-morning brought unexpected work. A woman from a respectable street sent for me quietly, through a boy paid not to ask questions. Her husband traveled often, she said. She needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't judge or repeat her words. I went because coin is persuasive and because loneliness wears many costumes. We sat in a well-kept room that smelled of herbs and clean linen. She spoke of fear, of being seen only as a role, of days that blurred together. I listened, recognizing myself in reverse. When I left, she pressed payment into my hand and held it there a moment too long, eyes bright. We shared a look of understanding neither of us would name. The afternoon stretched. I bought a small piece of cheese and ate it slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be the last of its kind. I passed a group of apprentices laughing too loudly, their future still soft enough to shape. One of them stared. I stared back until he looked away. Power shifted in moments like that, brief and strange. As evening approached, clouds gathered again. The air felt charged, like a held breath. I considered staying in, but hunger and habit pushed me out. At the alehouse, the mood was tense. News had spread of a crackdown, of fines and beatings meant to remind people of order. Order always arrived on the backs of those easiest to reach. I stayed alert, close to exits, close to allies. Business was thin. Men were cautious, eyes darting. A few left without paying, fear making them clumsy. I let it go. Survival sometimes meant choosing which losses mattered. Late in the night, Anne returned. She looked thinner, determined. She told me she was leaving at dawn. There was work elsewhere, she said, or at least the chance of it. She pressed a small bundle into my handspread, a ribbon, a coin worn smooth. A farewell disguised as practicality. We embraced briefly, fiercely, then stepped apart before sentiment could weaken resolve. I watched her go, a familiar ache settling in my chest. Some people leave, some endure, both require courage. Walking home alone, I thought of all the women whose stories ended without witness. I thought of Anne's determined back, of the respectable woman's bright eyes, of the sick woman by the river. I thought of myself as a thread woven through their lives, temporary but real. In my room, I laid Anne's ribbon beside the wooden charm. Two small anchors in a world that shifted constantly. I counted my coins, planned nothing too far ahead. The future was a luxury item. When I lay down, sleep took longer. My mind replayed moments, weighed choices, imagined paths not taken. Eventually, exhaustion won, as it always did. Morning came again. It always did. I rose, wrapped my cloak around my shoulders, and stepped back into the city. Not because I believed it would change, but because I knew I could meet it as I was scarred, watchful, human. This was my life, measured not in grand events but in days survived, kindness exchanged, dangers avoided. And as long as the city woke, so would I, ready to walk its streets once more. The days that followed blurred together in the way only survival days do, distinct in memory only by what threatened to break them. I adjusted my routes, my hours, my expectations. Illness was a dangerous luxury, so I brewed myself a thin tea from herbs bought with a coin I could not spare. I sat on the edge of the bed, steam fogging my face, and promised my body I would listen to it that day. Listening did not mean resting. It meant choosing carefully which risks to take. I stayed near the river, where air moved and people were too busy with their own labor to look closely at mine. I helped where I could, earning a bit of food, a bit of goodwill. Goodwill could not be eaten, but it softened edges. A baker's wife slipped me a heel of bread without comment. A boatman warned me away from a street where the watch lingered. These were small mercies, but small mercies kept you alive. By afternoon, my cough eased. I took it as permission to keep going. The city rewarded effort, not caution. I passed a group of pilgrims entering through the gate, faces hopeful, shoes worn thin by belief. I watched them pass, weighing whether hunger or caution would win later. That evening I chose a quieter tavern farther from the center. The owner there tolerated me because I paid and because trouble seemed to avoid me. Sometimes reputation was simply the absence of disaster. I sat near the wall, drank slowly, listened. A man with a scholar's hands approached, nervous but polite. He asked for conversation more than anything else. We talked about the weather, about the road he had traveled, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. When he paid and left, I felt lighter than the coin suggested. Not all exchanges took something from you. Near closing, the cough returned, sharper. I left early, walking carefully, breath measured. At home I wrapped myself in my cloak and lay still until the city quieted. I pressed the wooden charm to my chest and reminded myself that forgetting was not the worst thing. Being erased while still breathing was. The next morning brought clear skies and a brittle kind of hope. I felt stronger. Time did not announce itself when it passed. It slipped by in the quiet spaces between breaths, between footsteps, between one coin earned and another spent. I marked it instead by smaller signs, the way the light shifted on the river, the smell of bread changing with the seasons, the ache in my knees that no longer faded by morning. One afternoon, as summer leaned toward its end, I noticed a girl standing where I once had near the edge of the market, pretending to wait for someone who never came. She was too thin, her dress too new, her eyes too alert. Hunger had not yet taught her how to hide itself. I watched from a distance, not out of kindness at first, but recognition. When a man approached her too eagerly, I stepped closer, my presence a warning. He scowled and moved on. The girl glanced at me, startled, then grateful. I said nothing. Advice given too soon often sounds like judgment. Still, when I passed later, I left a coin where she would find it. Survival sometimes begins with silence. That evening, work was slow. The city felt tired, as if it too sensed the year turning. I sat longer than usual, nursing a cup that tasted more like water than ale, listening to a pair of musicians argue softly over a tune. Their voices wove together, imperfect, but sincere. I wondered what it felt like to make something that lingered after you left a room. On my way home, I stopped at the river again. The moon's reflection trembled on the surface, never settling. I thought of Anne, and tried to imagine her somewhere safer, somewhere with fewer rules written for her body. I hoped she had found what she was looking for, even if she didn't know what it was yet. Autumn arrived without asking permission. The air sharpened, and nights grew longer. Business picked up as cold drove people closer together. With it came new dangers. Drunk men were clumsier, angrier. I learned to carry myself differently, to let my gaze harden just enough. I made allies where I could, other women, tavern keepers, even a watchman who accepted conversation instead of coin. Networks mattered more than strength. One night, sickness returned, heavier this time. Fever blurred the edges of the room, turned sounds into echoes. I stayed in bed, clutching my cloak, bargaining with my body. When the worst passed, I woke to find a bowl of broth by my door. Someone had left it. I never learned who. The city, cruel as it was, sometimes surprised me. As winter crept closer, I counted my savings and realized, with something like shock, that I had enough to choose. Not much, but enough. The choice itself felt unreal. Leaving would mean risking everything I knew for something that might not want me. Staying meant continuing a life I understood too well. I turned the coin over in my fingers night after night, weighing it like fate. In the end, I did not decide all at once. Decisions like that rarely arrive whole. Instead, I began to prepare. I sold a dress. I asked questions quietly. I memorized roads I had only heard of before. Preparation felt like hope without the danger of belief. On a cold morning, thick with fog, I stood at my door longer than usual. The room looked smaller, emptier, as if it already knew I might not return. I touched the wooden charm, tied it more securely, and stepped outside. The city breathed around me, indifferent and familiar. Whether I would leave that day or the next or never at all, I did not yet know. What I knew was this: I had lived. Fully, stubbornly, against the grain of a world that tried to reduce me to a rumor or a sin. I had been afraid, and I had been brave, often at the same time. The fog lifted slowly as I walked, revealing streets I knew by heart, for now they were still mine. And as long as I walked them by choice, not surrender, my story was not finished. Winter did not wait for my decision. It arrived like a debt collector, polite enough at first, then relentless. Frost edged the windows each morning, and the river slowed, thickened, as if thinking twice about moving on. I wrapped myself in layers that smelled of old smoke and familiarity, and I learned to wake before the cold could settle too deeply into my bones. Work changed in winter. Nights were shorter but sharper. Men drank harder, laughed louder, and expected warmth in ways that went beyond fire. I learned to negotiate faster, to choose rooms with doors that closed properly, to end things before fatigue made me careless. I saved more when I could and forgave myself when I couldn't. Survival is not tidy. One morning, as I crossed the square, I saw the girl from the market again. She stood closer to the center now, hair pinned differently, posture altered. Experience had already begun to shape her. Our eyes met. She nodded just once. It was not gratitude, exactly, more like recognition. I felt older in that moment than any ache had ever made me feel. I did not become her teacher. The city teaches on its own, brutally and without pause. But when I passed her later, I told her which streets to avoid after dark and which tavern kept its hands to itself. She listened without interrupting. That was how I knew she would last, at least a while. As the weeks tightened, I took more daytime work. Sitting with the elderly, carrying messages, cleaning where I was allowed. Respectability is a costume that fits awkwardly at first, but I wore it when it paid. People looked at me differently in daylight, as if the sun had rearranged their judgments. I did not correct them. One afternoon, a letter arrived for me. That alone was strange enough to still my hands. It had been sent through 3 people and a lie. It was from Anne. She wrote that she had found work, not easy, not perfect, but safer. She wrote that her hands hurt less and her sleep was deeper. She did not ask me to join her. She knew better than to make hope heavy. Instead, she told me the road she had taken and where it forked. Information offered freely. I pressed the letter to my chest and let myself cry for exactly 1 minute. Then I folded it carefully and hid it with my charm. After that, preparation became intention. I sold the last dress I loved. I paid my rent early. I gave away what I could not carry to people who needed it more. I avoided trouble with a new kind of care, as if my body were already in motion elsewhere. The city noticed, I think. Cities always do when someone begins to loosen their grip. On my final night, though I did not name it that then, I walked the streets slowly, touching walls, memorizing corners. I stood by the river and watched ice form along the edges, fragile and determined. I thanked it for teaching me how to move without breaking. At dawn, I left before fear could wake fully. I carried a small bundle, a purse that finally felt heavy enough, and the knowledge of how to disappear when necessary. I did not look back. Looking back is how cities keep you. The road was cold and long and uncertain. It did not promise redemption or peace. It promised only distance. And distance, I had learned, could be enough. I walked with my head up and my name ready, whatever name I chose to use next. I was not a lesson. I was not a secret. I was a woman who had lived a life that refused to be simple, and I carried that life forward with every step. Behind me, the city continued without noticing my absence. Ahead of me, the world waited, indifferent but open. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the day belonged entirely to me. The road did not soften for my departure. It rose and fell without concern, rutted from carts, edged with fields sleeping under frost. Each step felt deliberate, as if my body needed to be convinced this was real. I walked until the city's towers blurred into memory and then into nothing at all. Only then did I allow myself to breathe as though I had been holding it for years. Travel was its own kind of work. I learned the rhythm of walking early, how to keep my pace steady, how to rest without looking idle, how to read the land the way I once read rooms. Roads had moods. Some welcomed you with birds and open sky. Others narrowed and watched. I shared space with traders, pilgrims, and the quietly desperate. We exchanged nods, sometimes stories, rarely names. Names on the road were optional. At a crossroads marked by a weathered post, I met a woman selling hot broth from a pot blackened by long use. I paid with a coin that had traveled far before me and felt it pass on its weight. We talked while I ate, about the cold, about the roads ahead. She warned me of a stretch where kindness ran thin. Warnings are gifts. I thanked her and carried the warmth with me longer than the broth itself. Nights were the hardest. The dark is different when there are no walls. I slept lightly, wrapped tight, waking to every sound until my body learned which ones mattered. Once, a fox screamed in the distance, and my heart raced as if chased by ghosts. Another night, snow fell silently, and the world felt held, almost gentle. I learned to appreciate those moments without expecting them to last. As days passed, my thoughts shifted. The city loosened its hold. Memories became less sharp, more like stories told from a distance. I still remembered faces and rooms, but they no longer pressed against my ribs. In their place grew plans, small, practical ones. Where to stop, what to ask for, which skills to offer. I was good at listening, I was good at reading people. Those things traveled well. In a village near the fork Anne had described, I found work for a week helping with washing and tending fires. The labor was honest and tiring, and the sleep that followed was deep. No one asked where I had come from. They saw only what stood before them, and for once, that was enough. When I left, a woman pressed a scarf into my hands. Wool rough but warm. I accepted it as one accepts luck without question. On the last morning there, I stood at the edge of the road and felt something settle in me. Not certainty, not happiness, something steadier. The knowledge that whatever came next, I had learned how to endure without disappearing. I tied the scarf, adjusted my bundle, and set out again. The world did not open its arms, but it made room. Step by step, I claimed that space. And as the sun rose behind me, I understood that my life was no longer a single place or a single role. It was movement. It was choice. It was the quiet, hard-earned freedom of walking forward and knowing I could keep going. So I did. The road curved gently after that, as if easing me into whatever came next. I stopped measuring distance by miles and began measuring it by what changed inside me. My shoulders lowered. My steps grew surer. I no longer startled at every voice behind me. Fear did not vanish, but it took its proper place, no longer the author of my days, only an editor. I learned the customs of the road quickly. Which inns asked too many questions? Which barns offered shelter without comment? Which smiles meant welcome and which meant calculation? Once, a farmer let me sleep near his hearth in exchange for mending a shirt. The needle moved through cloth, the way time moved through me, now quiet, purposeful, leaving something intact behind it. In another village, I earned my keep telling stories to children while their parents worked. I chose simple tales, ones about clever animals and stubborn hills, nothing that hinted at the darker corners of the world. The children listened with open faces, trusting. When they laughed, Something loosened in my chest that I hadn't known was tight. I slept that night with their laughter echoing softly, like a blessing I hadn't expected. Not every place was kind. In one town, a man looked at me too closely and asked questions sharpened by suspicion. I left before dusk, choosing the road over the risk. Leaving had become easier. I no longer mistook endurance for obligation. That perhaps was the greatest lesson the city had given me. As winter loosened its grip, the land softened. Mud replaced ice. Buds appeared, stubborn and brave. I felt a strange kinship with them, pushing forward without guarantees. My body too began to heal in small ways. The cough faded. The aches lessened. I ate better when I could, rested when it was safe. Care, I learned, was a skill you could practice even alone. Sometimes at night I still dreamed of the city, the press of bodies, the noise, the bargains struck in low voices. I woke with my heart racing, then listened to the quiet beyond the firelight, and let the present reassert itself. Morning always helped. Morning was honest. Eventually I reached a place where the road widened and choices multiplied. Paths branched toward towns I had never heard of, toward coasts I could smell only in imagination. I stood there longer than necessary, feeling the weight of possibility. The girl I had been would have waited for someone else to choose. The woman I was took a step. I did not know if this place would be where I stayed. I did not need to know. Staying, leaving, beginning again, these were all things I had learned to do. My life was no longer something that happened to me in dark rooms and narrow streets. It was something I carried, shaped, and set down where I chose. As I walked on, the sun warm on my back, I understood something simple and profound. I had survived a world that tried to name me for its own comfort, and I had stepped beyond it without apology. That was enough. And the road, endless and indifferent, carried me forward all the same. The road did not ask me who I had been. It asked only whether I could keep going. By then, I knew the answer. I followed a path that sloped gently downward into a valley where the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. A river threaded through it, calmer than the one I had known, as if it had learned patience. Fields lay open and expectant, dotted with people who moved at a slower rhythm than the city ever allowed. I lingered at the edge of that place for a day, watching. Old habits die carefully. I needed to know how the light fell, how strangers spoke to one another, whether silence here was safe. I found work first as a helper, then as something closer to a fixture. I mended, cleaned, watched children when their mothers' hands were full. I carried water and news and the quiet understanding that comes from listening well. People took me as I was presented, a woman alone, capable, reserved. No one demanded more than that. When questions came, I answered them simply. Simplicity, I learned, was a kind of freedom. The warmth soaked into me slowly, as if my body did not quite trust it yet. Each morning, I woke with a start, then remembered where I was. Relief arrived like a second breath. There are always moments when the past reached for me. A laugh too loud, a door closing sharply, a man's shadow falling the wrong way. I learned to pause, to name the present silently. Here, now, safe enough. Healing did not mean forgetting. It meant not being dragged backward without consent. Spring unfolded properly in that valley. Flowers appeared where I hadn't noticed them before. The river ran higher, brighter. One evening, as I stood watching the water, I realized I had stopped counting coins obsessively. I still counted, still saved, but the numbers no longer felt like a verdict. They were tools again, not prayers. I chose a name then. Not the one I had used in the city, and not the one my mother had given me, but something in between, familiar in the mouth, light enough to carry. I spoke it aloud once alone, and it sounded like it belonged to me. People began to rely on me in small ways. They asked for help. They trusted me with keys, with errands, with worries they did not want to carry alone. I took pride in it without clinging. I had learned what happens when you cling. Sometimes travelers passed through, bringing fragments of other lives with them, news of cities rising and falling, of laws written and rewritten, of women leaving and staying and surviving in ways no one would ever fully record. I listened, and when they moved on, I wished them well without envy. My road had brought me here. That was enough. On an ordinary morning, those are the ones that matter. I woke before dawn and stepped outside. The sky was pale, undecided. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and felt not joy exactly, but steadiness, the kind that does not announce itself. I thought of the woman I had been in the city, waking before light, measuring danger, bargaining for space. I did not turn away from her. I carried her with me, not as a wound, but as a teacher. She had kept me alive long enough to choose this. When the sun rose, it did so without spectacle. Just lights, spreading. I stood in it and let it find me where I was. This was not a story of redemption or ruin. It was a story of persistence. Of a life lived in the margins and then, slowly, deliberately carried somewhere else. A story without a neat ending, because real lives rarely have them. I went inside to begin the day's work, hands steady, name known, breath my own. Seasons moved on quietly, almost imperceptibly, and with them I moved too. The valley became familiar, a patchwork of fields, fences, and houses whose doors always seemed to welcome me. I learned which mornings brought frost, and which brought wind, which riverside paths were safest, which neighbors could be trusted without question. Life here was measured in simple, steady rhythms. Water drawn from the well, bread baked in small ovens, chores done in the order that suited the day rather than the calendar. I began to notice the small, almost invisible ways the world rewarded consistency. Children smiled when they saw me coming, unafraid. Women asked my opinion on simple matters, and I gave it freely, without calculation. Men treated me as an adult with experience, not a shadow or rumor. The weight of past lives, the city, the streets, the endless bargains was still there, but it no longer dictated the present. I had learned to carry it lightly. Sometimes at dusk, I walked to the river alone, the same one that had greeted me the day I arrived. Its waters were calmer now, its surface reflecting the sky as though it had forgiven me. I thought of Anne, of the girl in the market, of the women I had known in the city whose stories were too fragile to follow. I hoped they were alive, safe, surviving in their own ways. In wishing them well, I realized I had begun to forgive myself as well. A few months later, travelers arrived a small caravan bringing news from distant towns. They spoke of harvests, fairs, disputes, and festivals. I listened, fascinated, and learned of things I could not have imagined while trapped in city shadows. Lives lived without constant fear, communities bound by quiet mutual respect, nights where work ended with laughter rather than dread. It struck me then how far I had come, not just in miles but in the shape of my own life. On a cold morning, I awoke to a soft snow covering the valley. I wrapped my shawl tighter, touched the wooden charm that had never left my side, and stepped outside. The snow muffled everything, softened the world, and for a moment I felt entirely present, entirely at peace. This was not a grand triumph. There were no songs sung for me, no statues carved. But the day belonged to me entirely, as it always had in the past few years, even when the city tried to claim it. I understood finally that survival was not the same as happiness, but it was the foundation of it. Every step forward, every cautious decision, every lesson learned had brought me here. The woman who once feared every shadow now walked confidently through the quiet snow, choosing each path with intention. And so I continued, as I always had, one step, one day, one life at a time, carrying the past lightly, holding the present fully, and trusting that the road, however long, would carry me forward. The story did not end, because real lives rarely do. It simply continued, in the quiet certainty of a woman who had endured, learned, and at last found her own place in the world. Years passed in the valley, each one folded into the next, with the quiet rhythm of survival and choice. I learned the language of seasons more fully, when to plant, when to harvest, when to carry water in anticipation of drought. My body, once tense and wary, moved through tasks with a steady strength earned over long years of vigilance. I no longer counted days by fear or by coins, but by small, meaningful moments, a warm fire on a cold morning, the laughter of children echoing down a lane, the smell of bread baking in ovens at dusk. People around me began to rely on my presence without knowing the weight I carried. I became a quiet authority, a source of guidance and steadiness, someone who understood hardship without preaching. In return, the valley gave me a rhythm that the city had never allowed: predictability without confinement, community without control, freedom without chaos. It was not perfection. The world never offered that, but it was enough. Occasionally, I thought of the women I had known. Anne, the girl I had watched in the market, the sick woman by the river. Their faces came to me unbidden, each a reminder that survival is always collective, threaded through connections that often go unseen. I imagined them thriving in ways small or grand, beyond the city walls that had tried to define us all. Winter returned, as it always does, but this time I faced it with preparation instead of dread. Fires burned in hearths where I slept, blankets wrapped me in warmth, and my hands, once raw from constant labor, were strong and steady. I moved through snow-covered streets and frozen fields without fear, noticing beauty where I could, appreciating the quiet resilience of life itself. One morning, I walked to the river, now familiar as an old friend, and paused to watch the current carry leaves and ice downstream. I thought of the city I had left behind, the narrow alleys, the low rooms, the bargains struck under the weight of necessity. I did not long for it. I did not resent it. It had been my teacher, harsh but effective, and I carried its lessons lightly. I had learned how to endure, how to negotiate, how to protect myself, and how to claim the small victories that meant everything. I realized then that the woman I had been, the one who woke before dawn to measure danger, who counted coins and counted shadows, still lived within me, not as a ghost, but as a guide. She reminded me of my resilience, of the paths I had chosen, of the courage it takes to survive each day when the world tries to decide your value for you. I honored her silently, and for the first time I felt whole. Spring arrived again, and with it, a sense of possibility I had never felt in the city. I began to dream quietly of things beyond immediate survival, a home I could call entirely my own, work that nurtured rather than threatened, friendships unburdened by judgment. These were small dreams, fragile, but I nurtured them carefully, like seedlings in the sun. And so I continued, walking each path deliberately, carrying my past without letting it define me, embracing each day as it came. The valley, the river, the people, and the rhythm of ordinary life had become my sanctuary. My story had no grand conclusion, no sudden triumph. It had simply grown into something stronger, a life lived fully, deliberately, and with quiet courage. Time passed almost imperceptibly after that, each day folding into the next with a quiet predictability I had never known in the city. I woke before dawn out of habit, not fear, and moved through the valley with a calm awareness. My body, once tense with constant vigilance, now carried strength tempered by endurance. Hands that had once counted coins nervously now tilled soil, carried water, and tended hearths with steady assurance. People in the valley came to trust me without question. Children followed when I walked to the river. Women sought my counsel on simple disputes. Men respected my advice without probing too deeply into who I had been. I realized that in this place my presence mattered, not my past. The freedom I had fought for slowly transformed from a fragile hope into a living reality. Occasionally, memories returned in fragments. Anne's voice, the girl from the market's wide eyes, the sick woman's gratitude, all came unbidden. I smiled softly at them, recognizing that my life had intersected with others in ways that mattered even when unseen. They were reminders that survival is rarely solitary, even when one must navigate danger alone. Winter came again, this time softened by preparation. Fires burned through long nights, blankets kept me warm, and my footsteps on the snow were deliberate and confident. I walked to the river, watching the current carry ice and fallen leaves downstream, and felt a serene sense of continuity. The river had taught me patience, and the valley had taught me endurance. One morning, under a pale sun, I realized that I no longer measured life by fear or by the weight of coins in my hand. I measured it by quiet certainties, the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire, the sound of children laughing, the weight of a steady body that could endure. I had carried my past with me without letting it imprison me, learning that freedom is not the absence of hardship but the mastery of living in spite of it. Spring arrived again, and with it, the world seemed to expand. I imagined new beginnings, not just survival, but life as a choice. I dreamed of a home that belonged entirely to me, of work that nurtured, and of friendships forged without fear or caution. These were small dreams, delicate as the buds on the trees, but I tended them carefully. And so I walked step by step, season by season, carrying the woman I had been with her lessons intact, moving forward into each day with intention and quiet courage. The story of my life was not written in grand events or dramatic triumphs. It was written in persistence, in the small acts of care and awareness, in the deliberate claiming of each ordinary day. I had survived. I had endured. I had finally learned what it meant to belong to the world, to myself, and to the quiet certainty of a life lived fully. And as the sun rose over the valley, illuminating paths that were mine alone to follow, I stepped forward once more, entirely free and entirely unafraid. The years that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, each one marked less by fear than by presence. I rose with the sun, tended the land, helped where I could, and carried on with a steady heart. The valley became home not just in place, but in spirit, a refuge where I could be fully myself. Neither shadow nor rumor, neither commodity nor prisoner of necessity. I learned to measure life not by danger, but by moments of care, laughter, and quiet accomplishment. Sometimes I walked to the river and watched the water move steadily past rocks and reeds, thinking of all the roads I had traveled, all the choices that had shaped me. I thought of Anne, wherever she might be, and of the girl I had helped from the market, hoping she too had found her own space to survive and flourish. My past was no longer a chain but a teacher, reminding me of resilience, endurance, and the quiet strength that comes from navigating a world determined to define you. The woman I had once been, the one who woke before dawn, who counted coins, and shadows, who bargained and survived in narrow rooms, still lived within me, not as a wound but as a guide. She had taught me to endure, to act with caution, to value myself even when the world refused to. And now in this valley, she and I moved forward together, stronger and wiser, carrying the life we had earned. On a morning bathed in pale sunlight, I stepped outside, feeling the cold air and the warmth of possibility at once. I had no grand fortune, no titles, no public recognition. But I had what mattered most: autonomy, safety, and the knowledge that I had survived every hardship, every indignity, and every fear with my dignity intact. I worked, I listened, I cared, and I lived fully. Each day was mine to meet, each choice mine to make. The city that had once held me, shaped me, and threatened me remained a shadow behind me, but it no longer defined the woman I had become. And so the story concludes not with spectacle, but with quiet triumph. Not with riches or fame, but with the hard-won freedom of a life claimed by its owner. I walked forward, step by step, season by season, carrying my past lightly, embracing my present fully, and trusting that whatever paths lay ahead, I would meet them as I always had, alive, aware, and entirely my own. The world remained vast and unpredictable, but I had learned the most important truth. A life lived with courage, persistence, and intention is a life that can never be stolen. And in that, I had everything. The end.